There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am with one of my favorite writers. I can say that now. I've read and loved two of his books. Thomas Grattan, joining us from New York, and he is launching on May 21st his second novel, In Tongues. Thomas, welcome.
Thank you. It's so nice to be back in conversation with you. I'm really excited.
Well, I am too, because I just finished reading In Tongues late last night, and I am just itching to get into a chat with you about it. I read Tom's debut, The Recent East, shortly after it came out. I believe it came out in 2022.
21, but yeah.
It came out in 2021. I think I interviewed you in 2022 about it, and that interview will be linked in the show notes. And so the first question, I love this one with all my heart. Oh my God. And so the first question I have for Tom today is, The Recent East was in third person with a few different points of view. And this one is first person with the protagonist's point of view. Tell us about why you made that change, or what that allowed you to do, or tell me what that was all about, Tom.
Well, I think, partly after finishing The Recent East, which was this very big, expansive book, I really wanted to do something very different for the second book. I was really interested in telling a story in a different way. And I have written both in third and first person, and I think they both have real advantages and disadvantages. And Gordon is actually a character. I had written a short story about him that was published several years ago, when he was about his relationship with his mother and his first sexual encounter with his other 16-year-old. And he was a fascinating character to me. And because was so much his story, and because I really wanted to be inside of his head for the whole story, when I was writing that short story, it was in first person, and it just made sense that for him as the narrator, and also because he's the person who's arriving in this new place and experiencing all these new things. So I felt like that made a lot of sense for him, for it to be a first person narrative. And I really wanted to be as close to him as possible. I wasn't really interested in the POVs of the other characters. It felt like a smaller book, a more focused book, and I felt like that focus was more possible in first person. And I also I needed a change. After writing a big book in third person, I just wanted something different too. So it was a mix of things. And I think also there's always instinct. I think when you start something, I don't even think about whether I'm going to write it in first or third. Just whatever the ideas are, they start to come in that voice. And so all the early ideas were in first person. So, and then I just went with it.
Yes, it's a very different story. And when you said you weren't so interested in the point of view of other characters and I'm not sure if you said exactly what they thought of Gordon, I thought to myself, well, Gordon sure was. Gordon sure cared what other people thought of, didn't he?
Does. And so I think that's sort of the interesting part of the story, is sort of it's about his own sense of self and trying to fit in with these people. And I also feel like I got a lot from the other characters because there's a lot of dialogue in the book. And so I feel like that's a tool I really use to reveal character, because I think Gordon is a character who is very blind to what he doesn't know and what he doesn't understand about himself. He is 24 for most of the book, and yet he's narrating it from some decades past. And so I think there's so much about his lack of understanding of the world and of himself that felt really important to me. And so my editor, after I got my first round of notes from him, and he said this line that initially in his notes that I found so confusing, but he said he wanted the book to feel more like a car crash that Gordon was about to get into, but that Gordon didn't know it was happening, but the reader did. And it was a very sort of abstract note, but after I thought about it, I wanted us to sort of see those moments where he makes these terrible decisions, where his selfishness does play a really big role in how things play out in the story, and for him to be a little clueless, because I felt like that created a whole level of conflict that I found really interesting in the story. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I'm going to have you read the opening in just a minute, but I just have to get this in here. And I hope I'm not saying too much about myself. I think this is not only my reaction. I think many readers will feel as I did, that yes, there is a kind of a car crash kind of chaos to the story, or to what Gordon gets himself mixed up in and instigates. But he is so relatable that I think that that's part of what I was still surprised at how much of a car crash it ended up being in different parts of the story, because I just related to so much that I was surprised, as surprised as he was.
Well, good. I
Yeah.
mean, it's funny because some of the early pre-pub reviews, and luckily they've been lovely, which is nice. But one of them referred in their sort of their tagline or whatever, referred to him as a miscreant, and I really responded really intensely. And then I was like, oh right, he steals from his ex-boyfriend. He kind of steals, so he does a lot of really really thoughtless things and doesn't really think about how it affects other people. But for me that feels that's a quality of being young often, is you don't quite know. But he really, I mean, I pushed it with him for the narrative, and because I think there needed to be a real rupture in the book. But I also found him, I got really protective of him. So when I initially read that, I was like, how dare you? And then my partner was like, well, he does do a lot of crappy stuff. I'm like, oh, I guess you're right.
Well, I feel protective of him too. I absolutely adored him. You're such a master at creating deep characters, nuanced characters that stay with me forever and ever. I'm going to try to remember to ask you a little bit later, do a compare and contrast him with Michael in
Okay.
the recent East. But first, I'm
yeah,
great. I'm itching to hear read from the opening, please, for us.
Sure. I will read the first couple paragraphs, so don't have to set a thing up. On the night Alan, my first serious boyfriend, dumped me, I lay awake on the couch I called ours, though he'd been the one to pay for it, waiting for anger or sadness or relief to come. What showed up instead was the suspended feeling that captures me from time to time, even now, like flinging myself from a diving board so I'm not rising or falling, but still. That weightlessness stayed as I packed everything worth taking into a pair of duffel bags and stole $200 from the drawer where Alan kept cash. It held steady as I drove to a dealership, its car's windshields laced with frost, and sold my own, lingered as I hitchhiked to the bus station where I waited in line behind a woman who took forever at the ticket counter, the clerk's mustache trembling with annoyance as she asked one question, then another, a custodian next to us smacking a mop up and down. But then another clerk showed up, sharp lines around her mouth and eyes, and said, next. And as my bags and I made it to the counter and she asked where to, my descent began. So I said the first and maybe only place that came to mind, one I'd never been to before. For that day-long bus ride from Minneapolis to New York, stillness switched to falling. Though as we passed billboards about all-you-can-eat buffets and abortion, as towns came and went with aluminum-sided sameness, I itched with the excitement of not knowing where I'd land.
I told you just before we got started here that I reread that opening this morning after having finished the book, and it's the perfect opening. And you told me that you fussed over that opening quite a bit.
I did. I think there needs to be a real sense of liftoff in an opening. I even remember in the recent East, the first chapter, there was something that wasn't quite right in that opening. And then I don't even remember when, but I had this moment where this line came to me. Everyone talked about the West as if it were a secret. And that just felt like that line was the thing I needed that I needed to get the story going. And for this too, it took me a while. And then this sense of Gordon as someone who just will fling himself in the air and not really think about where he's landing felt like a really important metaphor. And yet I also, when I first wrote this version of the opening, I think I fell a little in love with that metaphor, and it was just too much. So I had to really decide how much to keep and how much to pull back. And I wanted it to have a really breathless quality because it felt like so much, because he's living with a boyfriend for the first time, they break up, he moves out, and he goes to New York all in like 4 sentences. So I really wanted it to feel as breathless as it probably would to experience it as Gordon. So that's also why I really thought about where to include punctuation, where to break up sentences, or where to have these overly long sentences to sort of give that particular rhythm. So I was playing with it, tweaking with it until my editor was really like, we are now in copy edits. You can't make any more substantial edits, because that paragraph and I would even sometimes just send him an email just with that paragraph in it. I was like, I'm trying this now, because, I mean, everything in a book is important, but really that opening is it's make or break for, I mean, I think a lot of people will sit in a bookstore and they'll read the first paragraph, and if it doesn't hold them, they will walk away. And I wanted the story to hold people right away.
Well, it certainly does. And I just will mention quickly that in all the conversations about Alice Munro, there was one anecdote I heard from her publisher where she actually did pull a book from the printers. It was at the printers, and she pulled it, and we did the second half of the collection of stories, and they let her do that because it was Alice Munro. So
right, yes.
So tell us whatever you'd like to tell us about what happens next to our hero, Gordon.
our complicated hero. Yes. Well, he gets to New York. I mean, he really is a character who is quite impulsive and sort of makes this, even as in the reading, he just decides while he's standing in line or while he's talking to the woman at the counter where he's going. So this sense of having no plan really continues, and he doesn't quite know what New York will be. And so where he ends up is, initially he lives really far out in Brooklyn in Bay Ridge. He rents a semi-furnished studio, which is an attic above a garage. In my mind, it's an illegal studio. And it's right across from a grocery store where he gets a job stocking shelves. So this imagined sort of reinvention in New York initially is pretty dismal for him. And sort of this sense of floating and being unsure of what he's doing really continues until one night he just wanders into this bar, and there's this bartender there, and she's really charismatic, and he is really drawn to her. And long story short, they end up becoming very fast and very close friends. And within, I think, the second time they've met, she's like, well, I have this extra space in my apartment and I'm always at my girlfriend. So then he moves in with her. And that's really the beginning of when things shift for him. And they have this really complicated, but for me feels really a really loving and complicated relationship. Anyway, so the girlfriend of Janice, who is his roommate, gets him a job as a dog walker. And so suddenly he is a dog walker in the West Village in New York City, which is a super bougie neighborhood. And so suddenly he's around this wealth and he grew up in a pretty working class family. And so just the level of wealth and privilege he's suddenly engaging with is really, he doesn't really know what to do with it. And then shortly after that, there are a pair of spaniels he walks, and initially he's never met the owners, and one day they're there, and it's an older gay couple, and he starts up a sort of friendship with them, a fascination perhaps, and then very quickly they start hiring him to do other things, helping with a dinner party, et cetera, et cetera. And long story short, he becomes their personal assistant, and a lot of complicated things ensue because of that, because he starts working for them and he's both fascinated by their wealth. There's a sense of wanting something. He doesn't know exactly what he wants, but he wants more for himself than what he has. And so suddenly this world feels really enticing to him and also terrifying. So he gets very involved in this world. Philip and Nicola they run and own a fancy art gallery in Chelsea. And so the art world is in particular in New York is particularly wealth driven and insular. And so I thought that felt it feels really like when you're in the art world, people are speaking a different language. So I felt like that was a great place for him to end up. Long story short, he works for them and a lot of complicated things ensue. And that's sort of the premise, is or sort of working for them. And that really gets the story going, and this developing sense of wanting something more than he has and seeing this couple as a way to perhaps get that becomes more important to him. Yet he keeps making these sort of impulsive choices that don't really serve him and lead to some pretty crappy outcomes.
Okay, that's a great setup. I am always of two minds about using characters' names in a chat like this, because for the viewer who hasn't read the book, the characters' names are going to be hard to follow. So I love the way you set it up. You describe the characters without naming them. We're going to talk, I think, about some of them in a little bit more detail. So I'll just say that the new best friend, the lesbian pub owner, or does she own it?
No, she's just a bartender, but yes, but
the lesbian bartender is Janice, and we're probably going to be talking about her. And then this gay couple are pretty central to the story.
Yes.
And it's Philip, and he's older. He's pushing 70 at the beginning of the story. And I should say also this story is set in the early 2000s. We can leave it that way.
I forgot to mention that, yes.
That's fine. And then his lover, Nicola, who is a man, is younger. He's in his late 40s. So I have grouped some of my quotes into various of Gordon's characteristic or qualities. So I've got loneliness, craving attention, being painted, that's not a quality, but flirting, people pleasing, lack of confidence, honesty and stillness, and let's not forget self-centeredness. So which of those would you like to tell us a little bit more about?
Um, the first one you said was loneliness.
Loneliness is pretty central to him from I think in that,
Yeah.
very early. Doesn't Alan describe him?
He says he refers to him. There's something lonely about him. I think he said like a junkyard dog.
He is craving connection and relationship, sexual, romantic, friendship, all of them to varying degrees during the course of this year that we follow him. And he has some challenges within himself is to make and sustain authentic connection. So what do you want to tell us about that aspect of his character, which I found very relatable and very endearing?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's a character who, in a lot of ways, had to raise himself. I think he had two parents who I don't think knew what they were getting into. And he's both really funny and charming, but it almost feels like he's just grabbing onto something so he doesn't sink. And so I think whatever the shiniest thing is, he's holding onto that until something else shiny comes along. So there's something very young about him in that way. And I think those two things are connected. I think he's a profoundly lonely character, and there's a real craving for sort of some really deep connection, and yet I don't think he knows how to have those connections. And I think he's also so distrustful of a connection lasting that he's always just basically keeping all of his options open. So I think he is someone who both really wants something, but in terms of connection and love, and both physical connection, but also even as much emotional connection, but he also doesn't know how to be a grown-up friend and be a grown-up lover in a lot of ways. And so he's constantly just jumping from one thing to the next. So when he's close with someone and then suddenly he jumps to someone else, which really happens with he and Janice are really close in the beginning of the book. And then once he starts working for Philip and Nicola, this incredibly shiny, wealthy couple, his attention really moves there. And it is really hurtful to her in a way that he, in that moment, doesn't see, because his need to sort of to quell that loneliness is so great, and he will do anything to do it. He doesn't realize how he uses people in the process. But I do think he's a sad and lonely character. He's also very joyful and has this really exuberance.
Absolutely. So I have looked up just about 5 minutes before we started talking. I think it's an excerpt from an interview you did in advance of the recent East. The excerpt is on LitHub, and I wanted to lift this. Yeah, I wanted to lift this one sentence you said or wrote. I enjoyed exploring a story where there is pain and sadness and difficulty, but there's also a lot of joy and exploration at the center of it, and that resonates very much with your character Michael in the recent East, but it certainly and profoundly resonates with Gordon in this novel, In Tongues.
Yeah, I mean, that's clearly, if there are through lines in my work, I think I'm interested in both. I think there's so much queer literature that understandably is about hardship and suffering and just really deep sadness. But I think I wanted a story that has that, but also has the moments that make him a really complicated, layered character. And I think we were talking earlier about him being kind of endearing. And I think because he is sad and he's kind of a screw up, but he also is really fun and really playful. And there is just this energy when he's in this space of this expansive space. I always want characters who have a lot of layers and don't feel like they're being reduced to a singular emotional trajectory. And I also think for him, humor and playfulness is both a way of connecting, and it's also a self-protective device. I didn't want this book to feel too self-serious. So I felt like he is kind of silly and childish and funny. And so I think I need that to balance the moments where he is really feels profoundly alone. And I think if it were just the loneliness without the sort of the lighter or the more humorous aspects of his character, I feel like the book would feel a little too, I don't know, it would lose something that I wanted the book to have.
What was the line about? I thought I could put my finger on it. I know I copied it into my notes where he makes Philip, I think, laugh deeply at his little bon mot about abs. What was that? Can you
Oh, because Philip, we find out, who seems like initially this sort of very serious, buttoned up person, but every year for his birthday, he has a costume party. So Philip and Nicola have a house upstate, and they ask Gordon to go up and help them with the party. And right before the party, Nicola goes to exercise because his costume is very revealing. And so then Gordon says, "Oh yeah, the unexamined, I think it's the unexamined abs are not worth having, or something like that."
That's right.
Yeah. So, and it's a moment where he says this sort of kind of silly thing, and Philip really like laughs. And there's always that moment where you know someone for a while, and you like, oh, so all the laughter before has been this sort of polite laughter, and then suddenly it's as opposed to the laughter that is so genuine that they can't sort of hold it in. And I think for him, it feels like a real moment where he connects with this person who I think he feels very intimidated by and inferior to in a lot of ways.
And in a way, he doesn't see a lot of things about his own flaws or deficiencies or what he needs to work on, but yet he also has moments of insight. So right after he said that, he tells us as the narrator, "As I washed parsley, I chided myself for how much his laughter lifted me." And we see those kind of self-observations often in the story. And that's what I think. I'm mad at that reviewer too, who told what was the word? Miscreant?
Miscreant. It was a lovely review. So, but they said it's a story of a miscreant who grows up and that will stay with. It was lovely. I can't remember that's why I shouldn't read reviews.
Yeah, he was a much more complex narrator, and people that especially love character-driven fiction, this is a wonderful novel. Gordon is 24.
He is, yeah.
And he is a hottie based on the reactions of the characters to him, including his new best friend who's a lesbian who keeps calling him hot ass. Talk about how desire runs through a lot of the other themes that you're exploring in the novel.
As a young queer person, I think he is someone who just really wants to explore and play, and really he loves sex and he wants to enjoy it, and he suddenly comes to this place moving to New York where just the options feel much bigger than what he's ever experienced. And when I was writing, I think the first draft, I don't really think about themes initially, but I do think there are lots of about power in the book, and where Philip and Nicola have a lot of power. I think Gordon's uses his youth and attractiveness as a kind of power that he can lean on. But I think since we're talking about sort of the way that he's really joyful, I think there's a real exuberance in terms of him physically too, and sort of loving these possibilities. And so he's a young, horny dude, and suddenly is in a place where he has like his first threesome, and someone picks him up on the street, and all these things that just in sort of suburban Minnesota, he never would have experienced, right? That's where there's a lot of joy, where the world is suddenly bigger. There's a painter he becomes obsessed with and sort of I don't even know how to describe their relationship exactly. There's a moment in the book where he realizes why he's so obsessed with him is because this is an extraordinary person. And like the people he knew in his previous life were maybe even more conventionally attractive or something, but they didn't have sort of this bigger sense of themselves and of ambition, and have a particular kind of singular talent. And so I think he's realizing that he's around people whose lives are just much different, and for him they feel more exciting, especially as a 24-year-old just moving there.
I definitely was remembering what my life was like in my 20s, and I won't embarrass myself by admitting how long my confusion about how to join up sex with the rest of my life, friendships and relationships, and being honest and being, a decent person, how long that confusion continued past my 20s. But it was incredibly, I keep using that word, relatable. I really, really identified with him. And right. You've mentioned the artist, Pavel, and he paints a series of paintings of Gordon, and that becomes pretty important for the story and for Gordon for better and for worse, in that it kind of brings out, what would you say, a narcissistic, or he becomes kind of more obsessed with how he appears to others, and that makes a lot of other things going on in this story more complicated.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, going back to that idea of sort of him feeling like his attractiveness is a kind of power, I think this is a place where it feels, it's almost like there's this concrete permanent evidence of its power. I think for him, it's almost, he almost buys into almost this, the way he's being commodified in a way. So it's an interesting, this is a little bit of a tangent, but years ago I watched this, there's this painter Kahinda Wiley. He did the official Barack Obama portrait, but basically he used to only paint men. He's a queer Black man, and but then he started painting women too. But what he does is he finds models on the street, usually in Harlem or somewhere in Washington Heights, and then he paints them in their sort of modern clothes, but like it's a recreation of a painting of Napoleon or something. So he basically takes all these, they're really interesting paintings, but there was where he basically takes men and women of color and creates new versions of classic paintings from 200-300 years ago with them in the center. And so it's really, they're really playful and really interesting. But there was a documentary on him doing this when he started painting women, and the women were so excited to be painted, and they made these amazing, some fashion designer made them these like $8,000 dresses and blah, blah, blah. And then they were painted, and they had 2 days where they felt like royalty, and then they couldn't keep the dresses, and they went back to their jobs and their sort of complicated, smaller lives, right? And he made millions of dollars on these paintings. The point is, when I watched that, I both loved how important this moment was for them, but it also was this small moment. And then I don't think it was exploitation, but it was a way that they were valuable for a while and then they weren't. And it almost broke my heart. In the document, you see them going back to their homes or their jobs, like working like at CVS, or like I think one of them worked for the MTA, for the transit authority. And so they had this moment where they felt really valued, and then everyone else moved on. And there's something about that I found really heartbreaking. And I was maybe thinking about that a little bit, about how Gordon feels really important. He wants to be valuable. And I'm just realizing my tangent was probably too tangential, and you feel free to cut it.
We're going to have our first fight now, because I don't think it was tangential at all. I think it actually fits totally into a lot of the things that he's dealing with or not dealing very well with in the story. Is how much is he wanted, in what way is he wanted. And there are some really deep, soulful aspects of that. His caretaking, his wanting to caretake, and so on, that get explored in just really beautiful ways in the second half of the novel. And that's all I'm going to say about that. So, tell us about Gordon's dad. Should I put a time limit on this? He's a piece of work.
Okay, I'll try. I am a rambler, so I will.
No, you're not a rambler. He's just a complex character.
He is a complex character. So Gordon and his father, when Gordon was young, were really close. And in certain ways, Gordon and the father have some similarities of really wanting, they're really searching desperately for some larger sense of meaning. And the father is kind of lost in a lot of ways. But when Gordon's really young, the father is marginally employed and often loses jobs and things. So he really becomes Gordon's caretaker. And the two of them initially have this really almost this symbiotic relationship and a real closeness, and there's friction and things, but then some things happen and the parents split up and the father leaves, and in leaving he stays with a friend, and the friend is newly found this very conservative church, and the father falls for the church. So essentially, when Gordon is, I think he's 15 or 16, one summer the mom's like, I'm sending you to stay with him. I need a break from you, which is an intense thing to say to your child. And he does. And initially their connection is rekindled, but then he has to go to this church with his father, and he's sort of fascinated and not repulsed by it, but Gordon is really fascinated by the idea of faith, and sort of wishes it's something he had. Like, so there's a moment later in the book where he's traveling somewhere else, and he's in a church, and he's goes there hoping to feel some sort of shift. So he really sees how much this means to his father, and he wants it to mean something to him, but he can't figure out how that authentically it feels made up to him. So I didn't want to write a book that was skewering religion because I feel like questions of faith or lack of faith are really complicated. And so he witnesses his father and several people in the church speaking in tongues. And there is a point later where Gordon, mostly out of boredom, decides to try it and fails, kind of epically fails. Dramatically fails, publicly fails. The moment when he does that is the moment where the real severing between Gordon and his father takes place. I think a lot about children and parents, and as someone now who's lost in both my mom passed away recently, my dad passed away a while. So it's very strange to not be alive and not have parents anymore, but and how you see them as so human now when you're an adult, which you don't as a kid. And so that's partly why I wanted Gordon to be narrating it from a distance, because I feel like there's a level of empathy, and there's a level of him. He's really middle-aged when he's narrating the book as well. And so I feel like he has sort of had to reckon with a lot of things that his parents had to reckon with. So I feel like it's a relationship that they both really wanted and didn't know how to sustain, both he and his father. And so I think that's kind of the sadness of it. Yeah, and then the title, which it just was really catchy, and I also felt like there's something about religious and physical ecstasy, and also speaking in tongues is all about sort of an unintelligible language. And I think when Gordon initially moves to New York, sort of all the wealthy people, especially in the art world, he really doesn't feel like they're speaking a language he understands. So he's trying, and so in the same way that he tries to fake speaking in tongues with his father, I think there's a way of trying to fake his way into this world too. As I kept writing and revising the book, sort of all these layers came out that made the title feel even more connected.
What I was thinking about, as you just said, that is about the aspect of performance and performing something. He was not feeling whatever the ecstatic experiences that makes these people speak in tongues like that, right. But he tried to perform it and he fell flat on his face, and that is kind of a harbinger of some of the other things he tries on performatively where he falls flat on his face and later on. And then what I love about the second half, that the ending of the novel, that we're not going to characterize in any detail at all, is how much he deepens not as a character, but as a person, in a way that is not sentimental, and it's partial, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, where he's exploring something beneath performance into authenticity that was just really, really moving. So,
well, that was beautifully said. Thank you. I was like, oh, that's totally true. I love someone articulate something that in my mind was really important, because I wanted some shift for him, but I often feel let down by a book if suddenly the ending, there's just like, and everything is different now. And that doesn't feel true to my experience.
And I have to say, when I found out what kind of work he was doing, we'll leave it at that, I thought, I hope this doesn't get too pat or too happy of an ending or whatever, you know what I mean? And it wasn't at all. This is as nuanced as the whole thing. And Janice, we're not going to say how she kind of re-enters the story. She never completely leaves it, because she's so much in his thoughts and throughout the whole story. But his friendship with her is central. What more do you want to tell us about their friendship? I loved Janice. What a character.
I love Janice. She's one of my favorites. And I love the two of them together. I feel like there's the connection and the sort of being seen that Gordon seeks. I think it happens most in his relationship with her. And I think as the book goes on, and without spoiling how it moves on, I think that is a place where he does shift a bit, where he actually can see her and sees the ways, because I think initially he both loves her, and he loves her confidence and her just warmth and just her joy. But I think there's not exactly objectifying her, but she's serving a role for him initially. And I think as the book goes on, his understanding of his friendship with her and the power of it plays a big role. When I moved to New York, I spent so much, I had this core group of queer women I hung out with, so much so that they were like, we would go to this bar all the time, Henrietta Hudson's, which was like I think it's still around. It's a pretty well-known lesbian bar in New York. And finally one friend was like, Tom, just to be clear, you're never gonna get laid if you're just keeping out hanging out with lesbians. So, but there was something about, I mean, I had a dear friend from college who I'm still good friends with, and she and I were roommates together for our first couple of years. And I feel like there's so many ways where queer men and queer women sort of create these really lovely, almost like chosen families together. There's a lot of joy in writing those two scenes. I feel like she was the one who really helped him navigate New York and move it from this sort of drudgery of this awful job to sort of a place of joy and expansiveness. I think a lot of people, if they would give a summary, they would talk more about Philip and Nicola, and they are very important in the book, and they are probably on the page more than she is. And yet, I think there's something of her spirit and just her complexity and her connection to Gordon that feels really important to begin and end the book with.
Absolutely. And you're mentioning Philip and Nicola. I just have to get in here as a comment, and you can comment on it or not as you see fit. But that you also there's so many ways in which the themes, the aspects of the story could have been cliches, and they are not cliches. And one of them is about class and about Philip and Nicola as being a rich, kind of a brittle, rich older couple that could have just been a satire or something, and it wasn't that at all. And so in particular, and this is the comment, the way that Philip re-enters the story at the end, I just found so moving, and I wasn't expecting anything like that. So there is just a basic nuanced humanity to the way that you bring these characters to life and put them through their paces that I really, really appreciate.
Well, thank you. And I wasn't really interested in writing a satire. I think, especially about halfway through the book, Gordon and Philip develop a real closeness. And Philip is also someone who is really struggling with, he's just turned 70. His partner, who's a few decades younger, is losing interest. There's a real sense that he feels an incredible loneliness. I feel like everyone in the book is kind of lonely. And I think more often in the world that's true, unfortunately. And so I wasn't really interested in him as a stand-in for some critique. I have plenty of critiques of extreme wealth, et cetera, but I was more interested in him as a complicated character and the way that he and Gordon for a time really connected. And there was something too, I was really interested in the idea of, especially for queer men, I think aging is a pretty loaded, it is a community that it often is so fetishizes physical perfection and youth. I was also just fascinated by the fact that, so Gordon's 24, Nicholas 47, Philip is 70. But when Gordon's writing the story, telling the story rather, he's probably in his 40s. So he's actually sort of closer to where Nicola was, right? So I was really interested too in this idea of how complicated that experience is. And it's not just for queer men. A lot of my friends who are women talk about the fact that there's this moment where they suddenly they become invisible in a certain way when your attractiveness is and your beauty is so much a part of who you are. When that goes away, I think it's something to reckon with.
I'm thinking now about how completely and utterly you avoid sentimentality. You grant your characters moments of grace, which is probably all most of us ever get, are moments. That's, I think, why.
Thank you. That means a lot to hear that. When I feel like I read a book and I feel like the author has some contempt for their characters, or just sort of has pigeonholed them into some very specific idea, it always feels like a loss to me. So yeah, it's a book about class, and there are some very wealthy people in here, and even they are dealing with a lot of complicated shit. And those moments of grace, and that's true. I think we have those moments and they become really important and help us keep going, but they are moments. And a lot of times it's just, those moments aren't always there.
Foibles punctuated by moments of grace. Well, it's not hard to tell that one of your creative writing teachers was Michael Cunningham.
Yes.
Yeah,
he's an amazing teacher, and he is still teaching, and he's just a very generous, lovely human. So yeah, he's great.
Thomas, I absolutely loved In Tongues. I hope it does as well as it deserves to. And thanks so much for telling us about it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate getting to talk to you again.